The morning air in Iowa carried the scent of freshly turned soil and diesel fuel. It was April 1978, and the sun had barely cleared the horizon when the rumble of a heavy truck engine echoed across the valley. Robert Mitchell, 28 years old, stood at the edge of his family's 320-acre farm, his heart racing with anticipation. Today was supposed to be the day everything changed. Today, two brand-new John Deere tractors would arrive, gleaming green and yellow machines that would catapult the Mitchell farm into the modern age. But Robert didn't know that his father, standing silently in the barn doorway 60 yards away, was about to make a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. The truck appeared on the county road, a massive flatbed hauling two pristine John Deere 4440s, their paint so fresh it seemed to glow in the early morning light. Each tractor represented power, efficiency, and prestige. Together, they represented $85,000 in debt that Robert had signed for without his father's knowledge. Thomas Mitchell, 62 years old, watched the truck slow down at their driveway entrance. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of mechanical work and farming, gripped the barn door frame. His jaw tightened. He had suspected something when Robert had been making secretive phone calls to the John Deere dealership in town, when he'd been studying financing brochures late at night, when he'd been talking endlessly about what the neighbors were buying. Thomas walked out of the barn with deliberate steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. Robert turned, his smile fading as he saw his father's expression. "Dad, they're here. Can you believe it? Two 4440s, just like the Hendersons bought last year. We're finally going to stop that truck," Thomas said, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Robert's smile vanished completely. "What? You heard me. Stop that truck before it comes through that gate." The flatbed had already begun turning into the driveway. Robert looked between his father and the approaching vehicle, confusion and anger rising in his chest. "Dad, I signed the papers. The deal is done. These tractors are going to save us so much time, we can." "How much?" Thomas interrupted. Robert hesitated. "How much what? How much debt did you put this farm in?" The silence that followed was broken only by the idling truck engine. The driver, sensing tension, had stopped halfway through the turn, waiting. "85,000, Robert finally said, his voice defensive. "But Dad, it's a good deal. 5-year financing at 12%. Everyone's doing it. The Hendersons, the Carlsons, even old man Peterson finally upgraded. We can't compete with a 1960 Farmall and a..." Thomas raised his hand, and Robert fell silent. The older man walked past his son, directly toward the truck. The driver rolled down his window. "Sir, I've got two John Deere 4440s here for Mitchell Farm. Where do you want them?" Thomas looked up at the driver, then back at the gleaming tractors. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a brief temptation, a fleeting vision of what those machines could do. Then his expression hardened. "Turn this truck around," Thomas said firmly. The driver blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me. Turn it around. These tractors aren't coming onto my property." "Dad!" Robert shouted, rushing forward. "You can't do this. I signed the contract." Thomas turned to face his son, and Robert stopped in his tracks. He had seen his father angry before, but this was different. This was disappointment, and it cut deeper than any anger could. "You signed a contract without talking to me," Thomas said quietly. "You put this farm, this land that's been in our family for 3 generations, at risk without a conversation. So yes, I can do this, and I am doing this. But everyone else is modernizing. We're falling behind." "Falling behind?" Thomas's voice rose slightly. "Son, we own this land free and clear. We owe nothing to any bank. Our equipment is paid for. We make a profit every single year. Tell me, how exactly are we falling behind?" Robert's face flushed red. "We're the laughingstock of the county. People drive by and see our old equipment and think we're poor, that we can't afford. I don't give a damn what people think, Thomas cut him off. I care about what's real. And what's real is that debt is a chain around your neck, and I will not let you put that chain on this farm. The driver cleared his throat uncomfortably. Folks, I need to know what's happening here. Do I unload or not? Thomas looked at Robert one more time, giving him a chance to back down. Robert's jaw was set, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. Turn the truck around, Thomas told the driver. These tractors are going back to the dealership. Dad, the contract can be cancelled within 72 hours according to Iowa law, Thomas said. I checked. Now go call the dealership and tell them the deal is off. Robert stood frozen as the truck began backing out of the driveway. The sound of the engine faded as it turned back onto the county road, carrying the gleaming John Deeres away. The farm workers who had gathered to see the new equipment dispersed quietly, avoiding eye contact with both father and son. When the truck disappeared from view, Robert finally spoke, his voice shaking with anger and humiliation. You just embarrassed me in front of everyone. Thomas turned to face him fully. No, son. I just saved you from a mistake that would have destroyed everything we've built. And one day, you'll understand that. Robert shook his head bitterly. You're stuck in the past, Dad. This is 1978, not 1930. Things are different now. Human nature isn't different, Thomas replied. Debt is still debt. And I'm going to tell you a story you need to hear. Have you ever watched someone you love make a decision that you knew would ruin them? Have you ever had to choose between being liked and being right? Thomas Mitchell faced that choice on that April morning, and he chose the harder path. But to understand why, we need to go back 48 years, to a day that shaped everything Thomas believed about farming, debt, and survival. It was 1930, and Thomas was just 14 years old. The Great Depression had already begun tightening its grip on rural America, but the Mitchell farm in Iowa was still holding on. His father, James Mitchell, was a proud man who believed in progress and modernization. When the local implement dealer offered financing on a new tractor and combine, James saw it as an opportunity to increase productivity and secure the family's future. Thomas remembered the day that equipment arrived. His father had been so proud, showing the neighbors, talking about how much more land they could work, how much more grain they could harvest. The monthly payments seemed manageable, just $45 a month for 5 years. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The depression deepened. Grain prices collapsed. What had been selling for $1.20 a bushel in 1929 dropped to 38 cents by 1932. The Mitchell farm was producing more grain than ever before with their new equipment, but they were making less money. Much less. Thomas watched his father age 10 years in the span of 2. The stress of those monthly payments, which had seemed so reasonable, became crushing. James would sit at the kitchen table late at night, going over the books again and again, trying to find money that simply wasn't there. Thomas's mother stopped buying fabric for new clothes. They ate potatoes and beans for months on end. His younger sister's shoes had holes in them, but there was no money for new ones. The bank didn't care about holes in shoes or empty stomachs. The bank wanted its payment, every month, no matter what. Thomas remembered the morning the bank representative came to the farm. He was a thin man in a suit that seemed too big for him, carrying a leather briefcase. Thomas's father met him at the door, and Thomas watched from the barn as they talked. He saw his father's shoulders slump, saw him remove his hat and run his hand through his hair, a gesture Thomas would later recognize as defeat. They lost 80 acres that day. 80 acres that had been in the Mitchell family since 1867, sold to pay the debt on equipment that was supposed to save them. Thomas never forgot the sound of his father crying that night. He had never heard his father cry before, and he never heard it again. But that sound, the sound of a strong man broken by debt, echoed in Thomas's mind for the rest of his life. The new equipment. The bank repossessed it 6 months later when James couldn't make another payment. So they lost the land and the equipment. They were left with 240 acres and an old Fordson tractor that barely ran. But they were left with something else too, a lesson burned into Thomas's soul like a brand. Debt was not a tool. Debt was a trap. And Thomas swore, standing in that barn at 14 years old, that he would never let debt touch the Mitchell farm again. Now, 48 years later, Thomas looked at his son and saw history trying to repeat itself. Robert didn't understand because he hadn't lived through it. He hadn't watched his father break. He hadn't felt the shame of wearing clothes with patches on patches. He hadn't seen land that had been in the family for generations sold to strangers. "Come with me," Thomas said to Robert, walking toward the house. Robert followed reluctantly, still angry, still humiliated. They went into Thomas's office, a small room off the kitchen that smelled of old paper and machine oil. Thomas pulled out a wooden box from the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were papers, yellowed with age. Thomas spread them on the desk, the original deed to the 80 acres they'd lost, the repossession notice for the equipment, a photograph of his father standing next to the tractor and combine just days after they'd arrived, smiling with pride and hope. "This is your grandfather," Thomas said, pointing to the photograph. This picture was taken in May 1930. By December 1932, everything you see in this picture was gone. The equipment, the land, and that smile. The debt took it all. Robert looked at the documents, his anger slowly giving way to curiosity. "I knew Grandpa lost some land during the Depression, but I didn't know." "You didn't know because I didn't talk about it much," Thomas said. "It was painful. But you need to understand what debt does. It doesn't just take your money, son. It takes your sleep. It takes your peace. It takes your choices. When you owe money, you're not free. You're working for the bank, not for yourself." "But Dad, that was the Depression. Things are different now. The economy is strong, grain prices are good, for now," Thomas interrupted. "But what happens when they're not? What happens when we have a drought? What happens when grain prices drop? What happens when interest rates go up? With those tractors, you'd be locked into payments for 5 years. 5 years of having to make that payment no matter what. 5 years of the bank owning a piece of this farm." Robert sat down heavily in the chair across from his father's desk. "The Hendersons seem to be doing fine with their new equipment." Thomas nodded slowly. "They seem to be. But do you know what they actually owe? Do you know how thin their margins are? Do you know what happens to them if they have one bad year?" Robert didn't answer. "I do," Thomas continued. "Because I pay attention. Bill Henderson owes over $200,000 between his land mortgage, his equipment loans, and his operating credit. He's farming 800 acres, and he needs every single one of them to produce well just to make his payments. He can't afford a drought. He can't afford a price drop. He can't afford to get sick. He's not farming anymore, son. He's just servicing debt." "But his equipment is impressive," Thomas agreed. "But it's not his. It belongs to the bank until he makes that last payment. And if something goes wrong before then, the bank will take it back, just like they took our equipment in 1932. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I want you to understand something. When I was 18 years old, I started working to buy back that 80 acres we lost. It took me 12 years. 12 years of saving every penny, of working extra jobs, of going without. I bought it back in 1948, and when I signed that deed, when I owned all 320 acres free and clear again, I made myself a promise. I promised that no Mitchell would ever lose this land to debt again. Not on my watch." Robert looked down at the old documents, seeing them with new eyes. "I just wanted to make the farm better," he said quietly. "I know," Thomas said, his voice softening. "And that's not wrong. But there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The wrong way is to borrow money you might not be able to pay back. The right way is to save, to buy what you can afford, to grow slowly and steadily. But that takes so long, Robert protested. Yes, Thomas agreed. It does. But you know what takes longer? Recovering from bankruptcy. Rebuilding after foreclosure. Starting over after you've lost everything. I've seen it happen, son. I've lived it. And I will not let it happen to you. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Robert stared at the photograph of his grandfather, trying to imagine the proud man in the picture broken and defeated. What do we do now? Robert finally asked. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields. Now we do what we've always done. We work hard. We maintain our equipment. We save our money. And when we can afford to upgrade, we'll upgrade. But we'll do it with cash, not credit. The Farmel 560 is 20 years old, Dad. How much longer can it last? Thomas smiled slightly. That depends on how well we take care of it. I've rebuilt that engine twice. I know every bolt, every bearing, every seal. It'll last as long as we need it to, because we own it. No bank can take it away. Robert stood up slowly, the anger drained out of him, replaced by something else, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of it. The guys are going to give me hell about this, he said. Probably, Thomas agreed. But in a few years, when some of those guys are struggling with their payments, when the economy shifts and things get tight, you'll still be here. And then they'll understand. Robert nodded slowly and left the office. Thomas remained at the window, watching his son walk back toward the barn. He knew Robert wasn't fully convinced yet. Young men rarely were. They had to learn some lessons themselves. But Thomas had bought him time. He had kept the farm safe. And sometimes, that was all a father could do. The afternoon sun was high when Robert finally returned to work, checking the Farmel 560 that his father insisted on keeping. As he ran his hands over the old machine, he tried to see it through his father's eyes. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't new. But it was theirs, completely and totally theirs. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to be said for that. In the house, Thomas put the old documents back in their box and returned it to the drawer. He hoped he'd made the right decision. He hoped his son would understand before it was too late. Because Thomas could feel something in the air, something in the way the economy was moving, the way interest rates were climbing, the way debt was piling up on farms across the county. A storm was coming. Thomas didn't know exactly when it would hit or how bad it would be. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: when it came, the Mitchell farm would still be standing. Because they owed nothing to anyone. And that made all the difference. The weeks following the incident with the John Deere tractors were tense on the Mitchell farm. Robert went about his work with a quiet resentment, speaking to his father only when necessary. Thomas gave him space, knowing that some lessons took time to sink in. But he also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. Robert needed to see the truth with his own eyes. That opportunity came sooner than Thomas expected. It was a Saturday in late May when Robert drove into town for supplies. The main street of Oak Ridge, Iowa, was quiet, as it usually was on weekend mornings. Robert parked in front of the hardware store and was about to go inside when he heard raised voices coming from the John Deere dealership across the street. Curiosity drew him closer. Through the large glass windows, he could see Bill Henderson, their neighbor, standing in front of the sales manager's desk. Even from outside, Robert could see that Bill's face was red, his posture aggressive. "I've made every payment on time for 2 years." Bill's voice carried through the glass. "Every single one. And now you're telling me you won't extend my operating credit?" The sales manager, a man named Frank Dutton whom Robert had dealt with when ordering the tractors, looked uncomfortable. "Bill, it's not my decision. It's coming from corporate. They're tightening credit across the board. Interest rates are climbing, and they're getting nervous about exposure. Nervous? Bill's voice cracked. I'm the one who should be nervous. I've got 800 acres planted, and I need that credit line for chemicals and fuel. What am I supposed to do? I'm sorry, Bill. Maybe try the bank. I've already maxed out my line at the bank. Bill shouted. That's why I needed the dealership credit. Robert stood frozen outside, watching his neighbor, a man he'd envied just weeks ago for his modern equipment and large operation, come apart at the seams. Bill Henderson, who had seemed so successful, so confident, was drowning in debt and couldn't even afford to finish the season. Frank Dutton said something else that Robert couldn't hear, and Bill slammed his hand on the desk before storming toward the door. Robert quickly stepped back, pretending to be walking past, but Bill saw him anyway. Robert, Bill said, his voice hoarse. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since Robert had last seen him. Hey, Bill, Robert replied awkwardly. Everything okay? Bill laughed bitterly. No, everything's not okay. But I guess you're one of the lucky ones, aren't you? I heard your dad sent those new John Deeres back. Robert felt his face flush, remembering the humiliation of that day. Yeah, he did. Smart man, your father, Bill said, and there was no sarcasm in his voice, only exhaustion. I wish I'd listened to him when he tried to warn me 3 years ago. But I thought I knew better. I thought bigger was always better. More land, more equipment, more production. He shook his head. More debt is what it was. And now? Now what? Robert asked quietly. Bill looked at him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. You want to see what success really looks like? Come on. I'll show you. Robert followed Bill to his truck, and they drove in silence to the Henderson farm. It was impressive, 800 acres of prime Iowa farmland, a large modern barn, grain bins that gleamed in the sunlight, and equipment that made the Mitchell farm look like a museum. But when they pulled into the driveway, Robert noticed things he hadn't seen before. The house needed paint. The fence was sagging in places. Bill's wife, Mary, was hanging laundry on a line, wearing a dress that had been mended multiple times. Bill led Robert into his office, a cluttered room in the barn filled with papers and files. He pulled out a ledger and opened it on the desk. Take a look, Bill said. This is what modern farming looks like. Robert looked at the numbers and felt his stomach drop. The Henderson farm had gross revenues of over $400,000 a year, but the expenses were staggering. Equipment payments, $48,000 annually. Land mortgage, $32,000. Operating credit interest, $18,000. Fuel, chemicals, seed, insurance, taxes, the list went on and on. Last year, Bill said, after all expenses, I cleared $23,000. $23,000 on 800 acres. Your dad probably clears that much on his 320 acres, and he doesn't have any debt payments. Robert stared at the numbers, unable to speak. And this year? Bill continued. This year I might not clear anything. Interest rates have gone from 8% to 12% in the last 18 months. My operating credit costs are killing me. Fuel prices are up. And now the dealership won't extend my credit, so I might not even be able to finish the season. What will you do? Robert asked. Bill sat down heavily in his chair. I don't know. Sell some equipment, maybe. Try to get another loan. Work off farm to make the payments. He looked up at Robert. You know what the worst part is? I'm not even farming anymore. I'm just trying to service debt. Every decision I make isn't about what's best for the land or the crops. It's about whether I can make the payment. That's not farming. That's slavery. Robert left the Henderson farm in a daze. He drove slowly back to the Mitchell property, Bill's words echoing in his mind. When he arrived home, he found his father in the machine shop, working on the Farmel 560. Thomas looked up as Robert entered. "Get the supplies?" "I forgot them," Robert admitted. "Dad, I need to talk to you." They sat on old wooden crates in the shop, and Robert told his father everything he'd seen and heard. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When Robert finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Bill Henderson is a good farmer. He works hard, he knows his land, he makes good decisions about crops and timing. But he made one bad decision, and that one decision is destroying everything else he does right." "The debt," Robert said. "The debt," Thomas confirmed. "See, son, debt changes the equation. When you owe money, you're not free to make the best decisions. You're forced to make decisions based on the payment schedule. You can't afford to let a field rest. You can't afford to wait for better prices. You can't afford to invest in soil health or long-term improvements. You have to extract maximum production right now, every year, no matter what, because the payment is due whether you have a good year or a bad year." Robert nodded slowly, finally beginning to understand. "And without debt?" "Without debt, you have options," Thomas said. "You can make decisions based on what's best for the farm, not what's best for the bank. You can weather a bad year. You can wait for better prices. You can invest in improvements that might not pay off for 5 or 10 years. You're free." "But how do we grow?" Robert asked. "How do we improve without borrowing?" Thomas smiled. "Slowly. Carefully. We save money from good years. We buy used equipment that we can afford. We make improvements that we can pay for in cash. It's not glamorous, and it's not fast, but it's sustainable. And most importantly, it's safe." Robert looked at the old Farmel 560, seeing it with completely new eyes. This tractor is 20 years old," Thomas said. "But it's ours. I've rebuilt it twice. I know every part of it. It'll run for another 20 years if we take care of it. And every hour it runs, every acre it works, that's profit for us. Not for a bank. For us." "I'm sorry, Dad," Robert said quietly. "I should have listened to you." Thomas put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You're listening now. That's what matters." Over the next few months, Robert began to see the farm differently. He started paying attention to the neighbors, really paying attention. He noticed which farms were thriving and which were just surviving. He noticed that the farms with the newest equipment often had the most stressed-looking farmers. He noticed that the farmers who seemed most at peace were the ones who owned their land and equipment free and clear. He also started learning from his father in a new way. Thomas taught him how to rebuild engines, how to fabricate parts, how to maintain equipment so it would last decades instead of years. Robert discovered that there was a deep satisfaction in this work, in understanding machines so completely that you could keep them running indefinitely. "This is real knowledge," Thomas told him one day as they were replacing the clutch in the Farmel. "This is the kind of knowledge that makes you independent. When you can fix your own equipment, you're not at the mercy of dealerships or mechanics. You're self-sufficient." Robert found himself enjoying the work more than he'd expected. There was something almost meditative about taking apart a complex machine. Understanding how each piece worked, and putting it back together better than before. But the real education came in the fall of 1979, when the agricultural economy began to shift in ways that would change everything. Interest rates, which had been climbing slowly, suddenly began to soar. The Federal Reserve, trying to combat inflation, raised the prime rate to levels not seen in decades. By the end of 1979, interest rates had hit 15%. By 1980, they would reach 20%. For farmers carrying debt, this was catastrophic. Loans that had seemed manageable at 8 or 10% became crushing at 15 or 20%. Operating costs exploded. Land values, which had been rising steadily, suddenly plateaued and then began to fall. The Henderson farm was one of the first casualties. In the spring of 1980, unable to secure operating credit and unable to make his equipment payments, Bill Henderson filed for bankruptcy. The farm that had looked so impressive, so successful, was sold at auction. 800 acres, all that modern equipment, the house, the barns, everything went to pay the debts. Robert and Thomas attended the auction, not to buy, but to bear witness. They watched as Bill's John Deere 4440s, the same model Robert had tried to buy, sold for less than half what Bill had paid for them. They watched as Bill and Mary Henderson stood to the side, holding their children, watching their life's work disappear. After the auction, Bill found Thomas in the crowd. "You tried to warn me," he said simply. "I'm sorry it came to this," Thomas replied. Bill nodded. "We're moving to Des Moines. I got a job at a factory. It's not farming, but at least I'll be able to feed my family without wondering if the bank is going to take it all away." He paused. "Take care of your son, Thomas. Make sure he understands what you tried to teach me." "I will," Thomas promised. As they drove home from the auction, Robert was quiet. "Finally," he said, "that could have been us." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "If I hadn't sent those tractors back, that could have been us." Robert looked out at the Mitchell farm as they pulled into the driveway. The old Farmall 560 was parked by the barn, not shiny, not new, but solid and dependable. The land stretched out around them, 320 acres that they owned completely, with no bank holding a claim to any of it. "Thank you, Dad," Robert said. "Thank you for being stubborn. Thank you for embarrassing me. Thank you for saving us." Thomas smiled. "That's what fathers do, son. We make the hard decisions so our children don't have to live with the consequences of the easy ones." But the crisis was only beginning. The Henderson farm was just the first domino to fall. Over the next few years, the agricultural crisis of the 1980s would devastate rural America, and the Mitchell farm would face challenges that would test everything Thomas had taught his son. The question was, would the lessons be enough? The winter of 1980 was brutal, but not because of the weather. The cold that settled over rural Iowa came from fear and uncertainty. Every week brought news of another farm auction, another family losing everything they'd worked for. The crisis that had seemed like it might be temporary was revealing itself to be something much worse, a fundamental restructuring of American agriculture that would leave thousands of families broken in its wake. Robert Mitchell, now 30 years old, watched it all with a mixture of horror and gratitude. Horror at what was happening to people he'd known his entire life, and gratitude that his father's stubbornness had kept the Mitchell farm safe. But safety was relative. Even without debt, the Mitchell farm faced challenges. Grain prices were falling while input costs were rising. The profit margins that had once seemed comfortable were shrinking. Thomas and Robert had to make every dollar count. "This is when discipline matters most," Thomas told his son one morning in January 1981. They were in the office, going over the books for the previous year. "When times are good, everyone looks successful. It's when times are hard that you see who really knows how to farm." Robert studied the numbers. They'd cleared $31,000 in 1980, down from $42,000 in 1979. It was still profit, still enough to live on and save some, but the trend was worrying. "What do we do?" Robert asked. "We get more efficient," Thomas said. "We cut every cost we can without compromising the land. We look for opportunities that others might miss. And we stay patient." "Patient?" Thomas nodded. "There are going to be opportunities in the next few years. Land will come up for sale cheap as farms go under. Equipment will sell at auctions for pennies on the dollar. But we can only take advantage of those opportunities if we have cash and no debt. That's our advantage, son. We can be patient and wait for the right moment." Over the next year, Thomas's prediction proved accurate. Farm auctions became weekly events. Land that had sold for $3,000 an acre in 1979 was going for $1,500 or less. Equipment that had cost $50,000 new was selling for $15,000 at auction. But Thomas didn't jump at every opportunity. He was selective, careful, always calculating whether an investment would truly improve their operation or just add complexity and cost. In the spring of 1981, an opportunity arose that Thomas couldn't pass up. The Carlson farm, which bordered the Mitchell property, went into foreclosure. The Carlsons had expanded aggressively in the late 1970s, buying land and equipment on credit, convinced that the good times would last forever. When interest rates soared and grain prices fell, they couldn't keep up with the payments. The 80 acres that bordered the Mitchell farm went up for auction. Thomas had been watching this land for years, knowing it would be perfect to add to their operation. The soil was good, it was contiguous with their existing property, and it would bring them up to 400 acres, a size that would give them better efficiency without overextending. "What do you think it'll go for?" Robert asked as they drove to the auction. "Hard to say," Thomas replied. "In this market, maybe $1,200 an acre. Maybe less. Can we afford it?" Thomas smiled slightly. "We've been saving for 20 years for an opportunity like this. Yes, we can afford it. The question is whether we should buy it." "What's the difference?" "Affording something means you have the money," Thomas explained. "But should you buy it?" "That depends on whether it makes sense for the operation, whether it'll generate enough return to justify the investment, whether it'll make us more vulnerable or more secure." They arrived at the auction to find a smaller crowd than Robert expected. The agricultural crisis had left most farmers either unable to buy or too scared to invest. The few people who were there looked grim, knowing they were benefiting from their neighbor's misfortune. The auctioneer started the bidding at $2,000 an acre, and the crowd was silent. He dropped to $1,500. Still nothing. At $1,200, Thomas raised his hand. "We have 1,200, do I hear 13? Silence. 1,200 going once, going twice, 1,300, a voice called from the back. Robert turned to see Frank Dutton, the John Deere dealer, bidding. Thomas raised his hand. 1,400. 1,500, Dutton countered. The bidding continued in $100 increments. At $1,800 an acre, Dutton dropped out. The land was theirs for $144,000, less than half what it would have cost 3 years earlier. Thomas paid with a cashier's check he'd arranged at the bank the day before. No financing, no mortgage, no debt. The land was theirs, free and clear, the moment the check cleared. As they drove home, Robert felt a surge of excitement. 400 acres, Dad. We're a 400-acre operation now. We are, Thomas agreed. But remember, son, this land came to us because someone else made bad decisions. We need to honor that by making good ones. This land is a responsibility, not just an asset. Over the summer of 1981, they integrated the new land into their operation. It meant longer days and harder work, but the Farmel 560, despite its age, handled the increased workload. Thomas's meticulous maintenance paid off. The old tractor ran as reliably as it had when it was new. But Robert noticed his father was slowing down. Thomas was 65 now, and the years of hard physical labor were taking their toll. He moved more stiffly in the mornings, took longer to recover from long days in the field. Dad, maybe we should think about getting some help, Robert suggested one evening. Thomas shook his head. Can't afford to hire someone full-time. And I'm not ready to retire yet. I'm not talking about you retiring. I'm talking about getting some equipment that makes the work easier. Maybe a newer tractor, something with a cab and air conditioning, something that's easier on your body. Thomas looked at his son with surprise. I thought you'd given up on new equipment. Not new, Robert clarified. But newer. There's an auction next week, the Peterson farm. They've got a 1975 International 1066 with a cab. It's only 6 years old, and it'll sell for a fraction of what it cost new. We could afford it with cash, and it would make the work a lot easier on both of us. Thomas considered this. You've been paying attention. I learned from the best, Robert replied. They attended the Peterson auction the following week. The International 1066 was everything Robert had described, a solid tractor with a comfortable cab, more power than the Farmall 560, and in good condition. When the bidding started, Robert took the lead. He'd learned from watching his father. He didn't bid aggressively or emotionally. He set a maximum price in his mind, $18,000, and stuck to it. When the bidding reached $17,500, he made his final bid, $18,000. $18,000 going once, going twice, sold to the young man in the blue shirt. They'd bought a 6-year-old tractor for less than a quarter of its original price. Thomas paid with another cashier's check, and they drove the International home behind the truck. As they pulled into the Mitchell farm, Robert felt a sense of pride. They'd expanded their operation and upgraded their equipment, all without taking on a penny of debt. They'd done it the right way, patiently, carefully, with cash. You did good today, Thomas told him. You're learning to see opportunities without getting caught up in the emotion. That's important. I had a good teacher, Robert said. That fall, working the expanded acreage with 2 tractors instead of 1, they brought in their best harvest in years. Despite low grain prices, the increased volume and lower costs per acre meant they cleared $48,000, more than they'd made in 1979, even with grain prices significantly lower. This is how you grow a farm, Thomas explained as they reviewed the year's numbers. Not by borrowing money to expand quickly, but by waiting for opportunities, buying smart, and growing sustainably. Every acre we added, every piece of equipment we bought, we paid for with cash. That means all the profit from that land and that equipment is ours. We're not sharing it with a bank. Robert nodded, understanding now in a way he hadn't 2 years earlier. And if we have a bad year? If we have a bad year, we tighten our belts and get through it, Thomas finished. We don't have payments to make, so we can survive a bad year or even 2. Farmers with debt can't. 1 bad year and they're in trouble. 2 bad years and they're done. As if to prove the point, 1982 brought one of the worst droughts in Iowa history. Crops across the state withered in the fields. Yields were down 40% or more. Grain prices, already low, fell even further as farmers desperately tried to sell what little they'd harvested. The Mitchell farm wasn't spared. Their yields were down 35%. After expenses, they cleared only $12,000 for the year, barely enough to live on, with nothing left over for savings. But they survived. They cut personal expenses to the bone, did all their own repairs, and made it through. Meanwhile, farms all around them were failing. The agricultural crisis, which had started in 1980, reached its peak in 1982 and 1983. Foreclosures were at record levels. Suicide rates among farmers skyrocketed. Rural communities were devastated. The Mitchell farm stood like an island in a sea of chaos. They weren't thriving, but they were surviving, and in that environment, survival was victory. Robert watched neighbors and friends lose everything. People he'd gone to school with, families he'd known his entire life, all swept away by the combination of debt, high interest rates, and low grain prices. And every time he heard about another foreclosure, another auction, another family broken, he thought about those 2 John Deere tractors his father had sent away. We would have been one of them, he said to his father one evening as they watched the news report on the agricultural crisis. Yes, Thomas agreed quietly. Those tractors would have cost us everything. The payments alone would have been $20,000 a year. We couldn't have survived this drought with that kind of debt. How did you know? Robert asked. How did you know this was coming? Thomas shook his head. I didn't know this specifically would happen. But I knew something would happen eventually. It always does. The economy moves in cycles. There are good years and bad years, booms and busts. The only way to survive the bad times is to be prepared for them during the good times. And the best way to be prepared is to have no debt. It seems so obvious now, Robert said. It always does in hindsight, Thomas replied. But in the moment, when everyone around you is borrowing and expanding and buying new equipment, it's hard to be the one who says no. It's hard to be patient. It's hard to look old-fashioned and behind the times. But that's the price of security, son. Sometimes you have to be willing to look foolish to be safe. The crisis continued through 1983 and into 1984. But by 1985, things began to stabilize. Interest rates started to come down. Grain prices began to recover. The farms that had survived the crisis, the ones without crushing debt, began to see opportunities again. And the Mitchell farm was positioned perfectly. They had 400 acres of good land owned free and clear. They had reliable equipment, all paid for. They had cash in the bank from the good years before the crisis. And they had knowledge, hard-won knowledge about how to survive and thrive without debt. Thomas was 69 now, and he'd begun to step back from the day-to-day operations. Robert, at 35, was running the farm with his father's guidance. And Robert had learned the lessons well. When a neighboring 40 acres came up for sale in 1985, Robert didn't rush to buy it. He and his father carefully evaluated whether it made sense for their operation. They calculated the return on investment. They made sure they could afford it with cash. And only then did they buy it, bringing the Mitchell farm to 440 acres. "You're ready," Thomas told Robert after they'd closed on the land. "You understand now what I've been trying to teach you all these years." "I understand that debt is a trap," Robert said. "I understand that patience is more valuable than speed. I understand that owning something free and clear is better than having something bigger that the bank really owns." Thomas smiled. "You understand more than that. You understand that farming isn't about having the newest equipment or the most land. It's about sustainability. It's about being able to weather the storms. It's about building something that will last for generations." He paused, looking out over the land. "Your grandfather lost 80 acres to debt. I spent 12 years buying it back. You and I just added another 120 acres, all bought with cash, all owned free and clear. We didn't just recover from what was lost. We grew beyond it. And we did it the right way." Robert felt the weight of that legacy. 3 generations of Mitchells, each learning hard lessons about debt and survival, each building on what came before. The farm that had almost been destroyed in the 1930s had not only survived but thrived, growing from 240 acres to 440 acres, all without debt. "What about the next generation?" Robert asked. He'd recently gotten married, and he and his wife were talking about starting a family. "You'll teach them what I taught you," Thomas said. "You'll teach them that debt is a chain, that patience is a virtue, that ownership is freedom. And hopefully, they'll listen better than you did at first." Robert laughed. "Hopefully. But if they don't, I'll just have to send back their John Deeres before they get through the gate." Thomas laughed too, and in that moment, Robert realized how far they'd come. The anger and resentment he'd felt that day in 1978 had transformed into gratitude and understanding. The embarrassment of watching those tractors drive away had become the foundation of his financial philosophy. "Thank you, Dad," Robert said seriously. "Thank you for being strong enough to say no when I couldn't. Thank you for teaching me these lessons, even when I didn't want to learn them." Thomas put his hand on his son's shoulder. "That's what fathers do. We protect our children from their own mistakes when we can. And we teach them how to avoid those mistakes in the future." As the sun set over the Mitchell farm that evening, the old Farmall 560 sat in the barn, still running after 25 years. Next to it was the International 1066, bought at auction for a fraction of its value. Both tractors were paid for. All 440 acres were paid for. The Mitchell family owed nothing to anyone. And that, Thomas knew, was the real measure of success. Not the size of the operation or the newness of the equipment, but the freedom that came from owing nothing. The security that came from being able to weather any storm. The peace that came from knowing that no bank could take away what you'd built. The lessons learned in 1930, reinforced in 1978, and proven during the crisis of the 1980s, would guide the Mitchell farm for generations to come. Because some truths are timeless, debt is a trap, patience is a virtue, and ownership is freedom. And sometimes, the wisest thing a father can do is send the truck back before it enters the farm. The years following the agricultural crisis of the 1980s brought a new era to American farming. The landscape had changed dramatically. Thousands of family farms had disappeared, consolidated into larger operations or sold to corporate interests. The farmers who survived were different too, more cautious, more conservative, carrying the scars of what they'd witnessed. Robert Mitchell was one of those survivors, and the lessons he'd learned shaped every decision he made. By 1990, at 40 years old, he was the primary operator of the Mitchell farm, though his father, now 74, still came out to the barn most days to offer advice and help with maintenance. The farm had continued to grow slowly and steadily. Another 60 acres had become available in 1988 when old Mr. Jameson retired and moved to town to be near his daughter. Robert had bought the land with cash, bringing the Mitchell operation to 500 acres, a significant size, but still manageable for a family operation. The equipment had been upgraded too, but always carefully, always with cash. The Farmel 560, now 30 years old, had finally been retired to backup duty. The International 1066 was still their primary tractor, supplemented by a 1982 Case IH that Robert had bought at auction in 1989 for $22,000, a tractor that had cost over $60,000 new, purchased for a third of that price from a farm that had finally succumbed to debt. Robert had also married, and he and his wife Sarah had two children, Emily, age 8, and Thomas Jr., age 5, named after his grandfather. The children were growing up on the farm, learning the same lessons Robert had learned, though hopefully with less drama. One Saturday morning in May 1990, Robert was in the machine shop with young Thomas, showing him how to change the oil in the International, when Emily came running in. "Dad! Grandpa wants you in the house. He says it's important." Robert wiped his hands on a rag and headed to the house, wondering what was urgent enough to pull him away from the morning's work. He found his father in the office, sitting at the old desk, the wooden box of documents open in front of him. "Dad? Everything okay?" Thomas looked up, and Robert was struck by how old his father looked. The years of hard work had bent his shoulders, lined his face, gnarled his hands. But his eyes were still sharp, still clear. "Sit down, son. I want to talk to you about something." Robert sat, a flutter of worry in his chest. "Are you sick?" No, nothing like that," Thomas assured him. "I'm old, but I'm healthy enough. I want to talk to you about the farm. About the future." "Okay," Robert said slowly. Thomas gestured to the documents spread on the desk, the same documents he'd shown Robert 12 years earlier. "I've been thinking a lot lately about legacy. About what we pass on to the next generation. It's not just land and equipment, you know. It's knowledge. It's values. It's a way of thinking about the world." "I know, Dad. And I'm teaching Emily and Tommy the same things you taught me." "I know you are," Thomas said. "And I'm proud of that. But I want to make sure the lessons don't get lost. I want to make sure that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the Mitchell farm is still here, still in the family, still free of debt." "It will be," Robert promised. "Maybe," Thomas said. "But you know what the biggest threat to that is? It's not drought or low prices or bad weather. It's forgetting. It's the next generation not understanding why we do things the way we do. It's someone down the line thinking they know better, thinking times have changed, thinking debt is okay now." Robert understood. You're worried that Emily or Tommy or their children will make the same mistake I almost made. Exactly, Thomas said. You learned because you saw the consequences. You watched the Hendersons lose their farm. You watched the crisis destroy families all around us. But what if Emily's children don't see that? What if they grow up in good times and think Dad is safe? Then I'll teach them, Robert said. The same way you taught me. With words? Thomas asked. Or will you have to send back their John Deeres too? Robert smiled. Whatever it takes. Thomas nodded slowly. I've been writing something. A history of the farm, of the lessons we've learned. I want it to be something we pass down, generation to generation, so the knowledge doesn't get lost. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. I've written about my father losing the 80 acres in 1932. About rebuilding. About the principles that have guided us. About why we do things the way we do. Robert took the journal, flipping through the pages. It was all there, the history, the philosophy, the hard-won wisdom of 3 generations. This is incredible, Dad. It's important, Thomas corrected. This farm has survived because we've made good decisions. But good decisions are only possible if you understand the principles behind them. This journal explains those principles. I want you to add to it. Write about the crisis of the 80s. Write about the lessons you've learned. And then pass it on to Emily or Tommy, and have them add their experiences. I will, Robert promised. Thomas leaned back in his chair. You know, when I sent those John Deeres back in 1978, you hated me for it. I didn't hate you, Robert protested. You did, Thomas said with a slight smile. And I don't blame you. It was humiliating. It felt like I didn't trust you, like I was treating you like a child. I understand now why you did it. I know you do. But here's what I want you to understand, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than losing those 80 acres as a kid. Harder than spending 12 years buying them back. Harder than surviving the depression or any drought or any crisis. Why? Robert asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Because I had to hurt you to save you, Thomas said quietly. I had to embarrass you, make you angry, damage our relationship, all to protect you from a mistake that would have destroyed everything. And I didn't know for sure that you'd forgive me. I didn't know if you'd ever understand. But I did it anyway, because that's what fathers do. We make the hard choices so our children don't have to live with the consequences of the easy ones. Robert felt his throat tighten. I'm glad you did it, Dad. I'm grateful every single day that you were strong enough to say no when I couldn't. Remember that, Thomas said. Because someday, you might have to do the same thing for Emily or Tommy. You might have to make a decision that hurts them in the short term to save them in the long term. And it won't be easy. But you'll do it, because you understand what's at stake. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 generations of farming pressing down on them. Finally, Robert spoke. Dad, I want to show you something. They walked out to the barn, where young Thomas was still working on the tractor under Sarah's supervision. Robert led his father to the far corner of the barn, where the old Farmel 560 sat, retired but still maintained, still ready to run if needed. I've been teaching Tommy how to work on this, Robert said. The same way you taught me. He's only 5, but he can already identify most of the parts. He knows how to check the oil, how to grease the fittings. And while we work, I tell him stories. What kind of stories? Thomas asked. Stories about you. About Grandpa James. About the Depression and the crisis of the 80s. About why we do things the way we do. About why this old tractor, which isn't worth much money, is one of the most valuable things on this farm. Thomas ran his hand over the Farmel's fender, the metal smooth from decades of use. Why is it valuable? Because it's paid for, Robert said. Because it's ours. Because it represents a philosophy that has kept this farm in our family for 4 generations. Because it's a reminder that new and shiny isn't always better than old and reliable. Thomas smiled, his eyes glistening. You learned the lesson well. I had a good teacher, Robert said. And now I'm trying to be a good teacher too. They stood there together, father and son, looking at the old tractor that had become a symbol of everything they believed in. In the background, they could hear young Thomas asking his mother questions about the International, his voice high and excited. He's going to be a good farmer, Thomas said. If he wants to be, Robert replied. But whatever he chooses, he'll understand the value of living debt-free. He'll understand that ownership is freedom. He'll understand the lessons. And if he doesn't? Thomas asked. If he tries to buy John Deere's on credit? Robert smiled. Then I'll send the truck back before it enters the farm. Just like you did. Thomas laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief. That's my boy. As they walked back to the house, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The farm was secure. The lessons were being passed on. The next generation was learning. The legacy would continue. That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner, Robert and Sarah, Emily and young Thomas, and old Thomas, the patriarch who had saved the farm twice, once by rebuilding it and once by refusing to let it be destroyed by debt. As they ate, Emily asked her grandfather a question. Grandpa, why don't we have new tractors like the Johnsons? The table fell silent. Robert and Sarah exchanged glances. Thomas looked at his granddaughter, this bright-eyed 8-year-old who would someday face her own decisions about the farm. Come here, sweetheart, Thomas said, and Emily climbed into his lap. Let me tell you a story about 2 farmers. One farmer bought new tractors on credit. They were shiny and powerful and everyone admired them. The other farmer kept his old tractors that were paid for. They weren't as shiny, but they worked just fine. Which farmer was better? Emily asked. Well, that depends on how you measure better, Thomas said. The first farmer looked more successful. But when hard times came, he lost everything because he couldn't make his payments. The second farmer survived because he didn't owe anyone anything. So which farmer was really better? Emily thought about this. The second farmer. Because he got to keep his farm. That's right, Thomas said. And that's why we don't have new tractors like the Johnsons. Because we'd rather have old tractors that are ours than new tractors that belong to the bank. But the Johnsons still have their farm, Emily pointed out. For now, Robert interjected gently. But they owe a lot of money. If they have a few bad years, they could lose it all. We don't have that worry because we don't owe anyone anything. Young Thomas, not wanting to be left out of the conversation, piped up. Dad says our tractors are better because we know how to fix them. That's true too, Thomas agreed. When you own something free and clear, and you know how to maintain it and repair it, you're truly independent. You're not at the mercy of banks or dealerships or anyone else. You're free. I like being free, Emily declared. Me too, said young Thomas. The adults laughed, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But later, after the children were in bed, Robert and his father sat on the porch, watching the stars come out over the Iowa prairie. They're good kids, Thomas said. They are, Robert agreed. And they're learning. Maybe not everything all at once, but they're learning. That's all we can ask for, Thomas said. We plant the seeds, and we trust that they'll grow. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Thomas spoke again. I'm proud of you, son. Proud of the farmer you've become. Proud of the father you are. Proud of the decisions you've made. I'm proud of you too, Dad, Robert said. You saved this farm. You saved me. You gave us all a future. We saved it together, Thomas corrected. You could have fought me harder in 1978. You could have found a way to get those tractors anyway. But you didn't. You listened, eventually. You learned. That took humility and wisdom. It took watching the Hendersons lose everything, Robert said quietly. That's what really taught me. Sometimes the best lessons come from other people's mistakes, Thomas agreed. We're lucky we got to learn that way instead of the hard way. Lucky, and smart, Robert said. You were smart enough to say no. That made all the difference. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, 2 generations of Mitchell farmers sat together, bound by blood and land and shared understanding. The farm stretched out around them, 500 acres of Iowa soil, every inch of it owned free and clear. The equipment in the barn was paid for. The house had no mortgage. The Mitchell family owed nothing to anyone. And that, more than any amount of land or any piece of equipment, was their true wealth. Not what they owned, but what they didn't owe. Not the size of their operation, but the security of their position. Not the newness of their tractors, but the freedom that came from owning them completely. The lessons learned in 1930, reinforced in 1978, proven in the 1980s, and now being passed to the next generation, would guide the Mitchell farm into the future. Because some truths are timeless, and some decisions echo through generations. And sometimes, the greatest gift a father can give his son is the strength to say no, even when it hurts, even when it's hard, even when it means sending the truck back before it enters the farm. The story of the Mitchell farm didn't end in 1990, of course. Farms don't have endings, only continuations, each generation adding its chapter to the ongoing narrative. But the principles established by Thomas Mitchell and learned by his son Robert became the foundation upon which everything else was built. Thomas Mitchell passed away in 1995 at the age of 79, having lived long enough to see his grandchildren growing into young adults who understood the value of debt-free living. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, many of them farmers who had survived the crisis of the 80s and who credited Thomas's example and advice with helping them make it through. Robert continued to operate the farm, eventually expanding it to 600 acres, all purchased with cash over the years as opportunities arose. He never borrowed a penny. He never financed a piece of equipment. He never forgot the lesson his father had taught him that day in 1978 when the John Deere tractors were sent away. Emily Mitchell went to college and became an agricultural economist, writing her doctoral dissertation on the role of debt in farm failures during the 1980s crisis. Her research confirmed what her grandfather had always known: farms with little or no debt had a survival rate over 90% during the crisis, while farms with high debt loads had a survival rate below 30%. The numbers proved what Thomas Mitchell had understood instinctively: debt was the difference between survival and failure. Thomas Mitchell Jr. stayed on the farm, working alongside his father and eventually taking over operations in 2010. By then, he was 35 years old, the same age his father had been when he'd fully taken over from Thomas Sr. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. And when Tommy's own son, James Mitchell, named after his great-great-grandfather who had lost those 80 acres in 1932, asked why they didn't have the biggest, newest equipment like some of the other farms, Tommy took him into the office and showed him the leather-bound journal that Thomas Sr. had started and that each generation had added to. "Read this," Tommy told his son. "Read about your great-great-grandfather losing land to debt. Read about your great-grandfather sending back the John Deeres. Read about the crisis of the 80s. Read about why we do things the way we do. And then you'll understand." James read the journal over the course of several weeks, and when he finished, he understood. He understood that the Mitchell farm had survived for 5 generations not because they were the biggest or had the newest equipment, but because they were the most disciplined. They understood that debt was a trap, that patience was a virtue, that ownership was freedom. The old Farmall 560, now over 60 years old, still sat in the barn, maintained and occasionally run, a reminder of where they'd come from and what they believed in. Next to it were newer tractors, all bought used, all paid for with cash, all owned free and clear. The Mitchell farm in 2020 was 650 acres, a substantial operation by any measure. But more importantly, it was completely debt-free. No land mortgages. No equipment loans. No operating credit. The Mitchell family owed nothing to anyone, just as Thomas Sr. had insisted all those years ago. And when the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted agricultural markets in 2020, when grain prices fluctuated wildly, when supply chains broke down, when uncertainty reigned, the Mitchell farm weathered the storm. They tightened their belts, cut costs where they could, and survived. Meanwhile, highly leveraged farms struggled, some failing, history repeating itself in a new generation. The lessons remained true. Debt was still a trap. Patience was still a virtue. Ownership was still freedom. And somewhere, in whatever place old farmers go when they die, Thomas Mitchell smiled, knowing that his decision on that April morning in 1978 had saved not just his son, but his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren, and generations yet to come. Because he had been strong enough to say no. Because he had been wise enough to send the truck back. Because he had understood that sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is protect his children from their own mistakes, even when it hurts, even when it's hard, even when it means being the bad guy. The John Deere tractors that Robert had tried to buy in 1978 were long gone, scrapped or sold multiple times over, their value depreciated to nothing. But the lesson they represented, the lesson of what didn't happen, of the debt that wasn't taken on, of the crisis that was avoided, that lesson remained as valuable as ever. And every time a Mitchell farmer looked at that old Farmel 560 sitting in the barn, they remembered. They remembered the price of debt. They remembered the value of patience. They remembered that new and shiny isn't always better than old and reliable. They remembered that the most important thing isn't what you own, but what you don't owe. They remembered that sometimes, the wisest decision is to send the truck back before it enters the farm. And they remembered Thomas Mitchell, the man who had the courage to make that decision, who had the wisdom to teach those lessons, who had the strength to save his family from a mistake that would have destroyed everything they'd built. His legacy wasn't measured in acres or equipment or dollars. It was measured in freedom, the freedom that comes from owing nothing, from being beholden to no one, from being able to weather any storm because you're not chained to debt. That was the true inheritance of the Mitchell farm. Not land or tractors or buildings, but knowledge. The knowledge that debt is a trap. The knowledge that patience is a virtue. The knowledge that ownership is freedom. And that knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, written in a leather-bound journal and lived out in daily decisions, was worth more than all the John Deere tractors in the world. Because in the end, it's not about the equipment you have. It's about the principles you live by. It's not about looking successful. It's about being secure. It's not about impressing your neighbors. It's about protecting your family. Thomas Mitchell understood that. He lived it. He taught it. And because he did, the Mitchell farm survived and thrived for generations, a testament to the power of saying no, the wisdom of patience, and the freedom that comes from owing nothing to anyone. The truck came back in 1978, carrying two shiny John Deere tractors that represented everything Robert Mitchell thought he wanted. And Thomas Mitchell sent it away, making a decision that seemed harsh in the moment but proved to be salvation in the years that followed. That decision echoed through the decades, shaping not just one life but many, not just one generation but several. It became the defining moment of the Mitchell farm, the story that was told and retold, the lesson that was learned and relearned, the principle that guided every major decision for the next 50 years and beyond. And it all came down to one simple truth: sometimes the most important thing a father can do is send the truck back before it enters the farm. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, activating notifications to be notified when new videos are published. God bless you.